Today we're going to talk all about changes in Europe in the latter part of the 19th century. And most of these are going to be things that deal with everyday life, but we're also going to touch on industry and economics and things like that.
So before we go too far into the second industrial revolution, here are some questions to help you review the first industrial revolution. So if y'all would like to, you can pause the video and discuss those as a class, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide.
The second industrial revolution is the second wave of industrialization in Europe, and so it's really from about 1870 on. This stage of industrialization focused on new industries such as steel, chemicals, electricity, and petroleum. So steel replaced iron as the major metal used in manufacturing. This allowed Europeans to build stronger and better machinery, railroads, ships, and weapons. And this was made possible through the Bessemer process, which removed more impurities from the iron in order to make steel. Germany really grew as a center of industrialization during this time and became the leading producer of steel. In terms of the chemical industry, there were all kinds of new chemicals used for industrial purposes, but also everyday life. So chemicals for dyeing cloth, first soap and other forms of sanitation, new medicines were developed. Electricity had a huge impact on life. So cable cars and other forms of electric transportation were introduced in cities. Factories now could be run pretty much 24/7 because they could have electric lights and have the machines run all the time. And slowly electricity was introduced into homes for both light and power. The second industrial revolution also brought a wave of inventions. So we learned about the steam engine in the first industrial revolution. In the second industrial revolution, we have the internal combustion engine, which was used for the first automobiles right around 1890 and later used in airplanes. New transportation and the need for fuel also led to the development of the petroleum industry because gasoline was needed to fuel all these new vehicles. Other inventions that helped with communication would be the telephone, the telegraph, the radio, and then other new forms of transportation such as the steamship and trolley and streetcars were all introduced. So factories became larger and more efficient as they were able to utilize electricity. There was even more mechanization than there was in the first industrial revolution. So the assembly line, which was created by Henry Ford in the United States, was introduced. Also interchangeable parts, which were invented by Eli Whitney in the United States, were introduced. And so this led to even more mechanization of production and even less things being made by hand.
And here's a chart just summarizing the key differences between the first and second industrial revolution. I'll go through it pretty quick, but then you can always pause and fill it in if you'd like to. So the first industrial revolution began in the mid-1700s in Britain. It is a transition from hand to machine production. So you might want to put an arrow there. The format gets a little weird when I convert these to video. So it should be hand to machine production. This first round focused on the textile industry. The major power sources were first water power, and then they transitioned to using coal to fuel the steam engine. The new engines, the steam engine again. The new inventions, you could list a couple examples. These are all ones that we've gone over before, and they, for the most part, have to do with the textile industry. And the standard of living for the working classes was really, really bad. And we read that excerpt from Alexis de Tocqueville in Manchester, where he described all the pollution and the terrible living conditions that people experienced. So in the second industrial revolution, that's the second wave. So that's from 1850-ish onward. And we already have machine production, so it just focuses on increasing automation. There's mass production of products like steel, the Bessemer process, which refined steel further into a higher quality product. Power sources, it's important to note for power sources that the steam engine continued to be really important. It's not as if that went away. And so coal is still really important. But petroleum and electricity are additional sources of energy that come into play. For engines, again, the steam engine continues to be really important, but the new engine of the time is the internal combustion engine, which became used in automobiles. And then new inventions, automobiles, chemicals, railroads became a lot more prevalent, and then new inventions having to do with communication, the telegraph, telephone, and radio are very important. And we're going to come back to that again when we study in the next chapter European imperialism and how important those developments were for Europeans to go out and expand their empires throughout the world. So the standard of living during this time, during the second industrial revolution, is still not great for people who are urban workers, but we're going to talk today about a number of reform movements that tried to improve the standard of living. So slowly governments are realizing that these things are problems, and they're going to start looking for more ways to address them. So again, if you need more time, just go ahead and pause the video here because I know that was a lot of information all at once.
So like you already learned, Europe became divided into zones of industrialization. And if we look at this map, we can see areas of Northern and Western Europe became industrial centers. So we of course know Great Britain because that's where the Industrial Revolution started, but areas of Northern France into the Low Countries and definitely within Germany became major centers of industrialization. Southern and Eastern, Europe industrialized more slowly. And this map shows the emancipation of peasants, so that would be like the complete outline of serfdom, really came later in these areas that are colored pink, and so that's definitely part of it. We can see those places had less railroads, less tapping into things like coal mining, and just less industry overall as we go through the 1800s. All of this industrialization also impacted political views. So when we studied the isms, we learned that classical liberalism in the 19th century tended to be people who did not favor government intervention. So they wanted a hands-off approach from government in terms of just regulating daily life and also in the economy. This definitely shifted in the late 19th century, where liberalism moved a little bit, I would say, more towards what we think of it today, which is that the government is going to get involved more to help people and have social programs. And so that's what happened. They increased intervention in everyday life to try to improve urban areas. So all of those issues of the Industrial Revolution, like we've learned about, the poor sanitation, the overcrowding, the disease, cities are going to take measures to do something about this. And part of this, too, is the development of mass political parties. So the fact that more people have a voice in the government and are able to express their displeasure with the way urban areas are going meant that governments were under pressure to make changes. So cities introduced public health measures. They introduced city water and sewer. Building codes and inspectors. So think about like the tenement buildings of the Industrial Revolution. They want to deal with those issues and make living spaces that are safe for people. Police forces are introduced really for the first time in a large scale in cities. Public transportation, lighting, street lights at night to make things safer would contribute to less crime. Urban planning and recreation. So we're not just going to let people throw up tenement buildings wherever they want. We're going to have building codes and zoning. Cities are going to decide where buildings can be built so that we actually have a plan of what the city is going to look like in the end. And that would include setting aside places for recreation, like building city parks. Because if you have all these people in an urban area and they don't have access to clean air or green space, they really want to try to improve that and fix some of those quality of life issues. So this definitely increased the size of government, which again is something we more associate with liberalism today, and increased bureaucracy. And it created a lot of new jobs too for people who could work in the government on these different projects. We've talked before about how attitudes towards the poor, especially in the, I would say, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, tended to be that the poor created their own misery. Like if they're poor and suffering, it's probably due to them not working hard or some kind of issue that they created. There's definitely a slight change in that in the late 19th century, and that doesn't mean that people fully embrace the poor and wanted to help everyone, but it's seen as a drain on society. Like if we have all these poor people living in terrible conditions, it brings the whole society down, and so we should do something about that. And so that goes along with these urban reforms, wanting to have clean water so that people bathe more. Clean drinking water became carried through tunnels, underground, and stored in reservoirs like we do today. There was also an attempt to make more affordable quality housing for people. This is definitely a limited effort, but things are starting to move in that direction in the late 19th century. Like I mentioned before, parks were created to provide green space for people, and cities were redesigned to match growth. So one of the issues is with all these new modes of transportation, cities aren't equipped to deal with that. So their roads often were very narrow, and so if we're going to have automobiles and streetcars and trolleys and new theaters, department stores, we need to redesign the cities to make room for all of that. And if we're going to have all these new amenities in the cities, people need a way to be able to travel and get there. One of the people who's probably really known for this redesign of cities is Napoleon III, who you learned about. And so he really redesigned Paris. You can see an example on the right of an rendering of what this is going to look like. He made really wide boulevards within Paris to accommodate more traffic and new forms of transportation. You can see at the bottom kind of the legacy of that, the green space that he created within the city, and he actually ended up tearing down a lot of old buildings and just totally redeveloping the network of the city, again, widening roads and making use of these new forms of transportation. One huge change is the development of compulsory education in the late 19th century. So European nations instituted compulsory, which means mandatory, free elementary education. There are several reasons why this was considered important. First of all, especially with the Second Industrial Revolution, we have new jobs that require a little bit more knowledge. So think about any kind of office job, which is very common today. Those are all jobs that were created as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Think about managerial jobs, being a manager or a foreman or something like that. That's created during the Industrial Revolution too. And in order to do those jobs, you at least need to be able to read and write and probably do basic math. So think about even jobs like a secretary, a clerk, a shop worker. They need to have those basic skills. And without elementary education, those things are not really that common in people's lives. So that's one reason. Another reason is more and more people are gaining the right to vote in Europe. So the extension of franchise. And at least theoretically, if we're going to have more people voting, we would like those people to have some kind of knowledge about who they're voting for and what they're selecting. So the ability to be able to read a newspaper and learn about the candidates becomes more important as more people are voting. And then there's also just the education allows countries to try to instill the values that they want within their population. So think about all the nationalism and revolution of the 19th century. Education is a way that you can mold people to be good citizens of your country. You can promote national unity and patriotism through schools, provide secular teachings, so teach them what the government wants them to know, not necessarily what they'd learn in a religious school. And especially for boys at this time, you want them to have certain kind of standard knowledge where if they become a soldier in the future, they'll have that. So those are all important reasons why education became free and compulsory. Now, education was provided for both boys and girls. It was still common in the 19th century to think that girls didn't need all the same skills and knowledge as boys. And so in some places, they were still taught separately, and girls learned more kinds of tasks that would be necessary to be a homemaker, for example. And the expansion of education had a huge impact on women. This also opened up a new job opportunity for women because a lot of elementary teachers were women. And it was thought that that role of a woman as being more nurturing and motherly really suited women to be teachers. Another side effect is that women at this time could still be paid less for doing the same job, and so it was cheaper to hire women. And so a lot of teacher colleges developed to train women. This is not the same as a university because a lot of these women themselves wouldn't even have necessarily completed like all of what we would consider today high school. But it was also a good alternative for single women. If you were a single woman or you wanted to exist as a single woman, like didn't care to get married, this is another job now that you can have that's considered really respectable in society. The impact of this overall is that mass literacy developed. So really for the first time, the vast majority of people in Europe learned to read and write. And this also results in new forms of communication and literature. So like newspapers, magazines, literature that you can get at a moment's notice, like get the daily news, periodicals, all of that becomes much more popular as a result. There are also a lot of new advances in math and medicine and science at this time. So Louis Pasteur, who I'm sure you've heard about before, he discovered the germ theory of disease, that diseases are actually passed through germs from person to person. And so he developed methods of dealing with this. Pasteurization, which a lot of things we buy now in the grocery store, like milk, are pasteurized, where they're heated to kill bacteria in them before they're sold. He developed that process. And then he also used the germ theory to develop vaccines for several different diseases, like rabies, diphtheria, typhoid, cholera, and bubonic plague. We also had the introduction of new surgical practices. Now, it's definitely not to say that surgery, like you would really want to have surgery at this time, but if you learned about, say, in U.S. history, like the Civil War, for example, in the United States, where they did all these kinds of amputations with no medicine, and they would just get people drunk first and then cut off their leg. I mean, that's definitely an improvement over that. So we have the beginnings of anesthesia, antiseptics, and pain medications. Now, I want to be clear here that antiseptics are not the same as antibiotics. Antibiotics don't come until the 20th century. So infection is still a big risk with surgery. Antiseptics are things to like maybe attempt to keep the wound clean or keep the area clean, but it's not the same as an antibiotic. And then we also have the gradual development of medical schools and the standardization of medical training. Again, this really doesn't take off to what we think of as training of doctors now until the 20th century, but they're slowly moving in that direction. Other advances, which I'm sure you know these as well, Mendeleev developed the periodic table of the elements. Michael Faraday discovered electromagnetic energy and one of the first primitive generators. And then Charles Darwin, on the origin of species, the idea of evolution, survival of the fittest, and natural selection, which all had a big impact on the way scientists did their work and just people's ideas about how nature and the world actually worked. So, realism and materialism. Materialism is the belief that everything mental, spiritual, or ideal is an outgrowth of physical forces, and that truth is found in concrete material existence, not through feeling or intuition. So materialism almost in a way goes back to when we studied rationalism. Like things need to be found concretely in the world. Feeling and emotion is not a valid way of understanding the world around you. And I'm not here to ask you these questions, but what events or changes of the 19th century would have contributed to this? Definitely the Industrial Revolution. And what movement is this a reaction to? Hopefully, when you think about this and you think that it's anti-emotion and feeling, you can see that this is a reaction to Romanticism. So Romanticism is a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, And then realism and materialism come after that and kind of counteract that. And we're going to learn, if you haven't already, I don't remember, we're going to learn about realism as a movement on its own. So we know that the Industrial Revolution created new social classes. And in the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution definitely led to more prosperity in Europe. So people's daily lives overall got a little bit better. And people who had maybe a manager job, owned a business, things like that, developed into the new middle class. And so there became the ideal middle class family and certain values ascribed to that in the late 19th century. So the ideal middle class family would be the mother of the family stays at home. So this denotes that you're a little bit more prosperous than the average person, because we know in a lot of industrial working families, both parents worked outside the home and even the children worked outside the home. So if you are able to have the woman stay at home and only the husband goes off to work, that definitely shows that you're a little bit more upper class. And women who stayed at home were supposed to organize activities and help educate their children. Mothers should teach them practical skills that they're going to need later on in life, and also religious values. Another part of the ideal middle class family is that you demonstrate your wealth through having a servant or two, maybe like a cook or a housekeeper. This is definitely hard to achieve in most families, to be able to afford to actually employ someone else to come into your home. But again, it emphasized that you're above the industrial working class. You're the newer, wealthier people. And so men were supposed to work outside the home, and activities developed for boys that were supposed to really emphasize masculinity and toughness. So an example from this time period of a new organization that developed were the Boy Scouts, who taught like survival skills, basic military skills, things like that. During this time period, we also have the notion of family togetherness develop. So if you think about before the Industrial Revolution, when most people lived on a farm, their families were together all the time. And so they didn't necessarily even think about that as a special thing that they needed to set time aside for. Now in the 19th century, when in the first part of the 19th century, people were working in factories apart from their family all day, now people want to recapture that in the late 19th century, recapture that time together as a family. And so activities that we today might think of as typical family activities, that developed in the late 19th century. So things like going on a picnic, going on a vacation was really a new concept. Developing traditions with your family for certain holidays that you all come together as a family, like at Christmas, and do certain things. Those are examples. And these changes, again, started in the middle class and then over time diffused down to the working class over time. These pictures just show you some examples of what I just talked about. So at the top, we have a family getting together for a large holiday meal. At the bottom, we have a Boy Scout group. And then on the right, it demonstrates new leisure activities that families could do together. And I don't know if you can tell, but they're playing badminton, which became a very popular activity in some European countries. So this reaction to the Industrial Revolution against women working outside of the home also contributed to the cult of domesticity, which I'm pretty sure you learn about in U.S. history if you haven't already learned about that. And this is a belief system about women in the 1800s. It was especially embraced by the upper and middle classes. And again, it's kind of a reaction to the first part of the Industrial Revolution where so many women were working outside the home. Now that the cult of domesticity kind of tries to recapture a woman's role as wife and mother. And so some of the values or character qualities that women were supposed to have, according to this belief system, was they were to be religious and train their children in that way, to be feminine in terms of just how they acted and how they dressed, to be submissive to their husbands and to other men in their families, and to be homemakers, that they shouldn't really strive to do anything outside the home, like they should be happy with their role within the home. And another way to phrase this is that men and women were supposed to have separate spheres of existence. So men were supposed to be outside the home, earning the wages, being the breadwinner of the family. A woman was supposed to be a wife, mother, and homemaker. So again, this was especially common in the upper and middle classes, because really in the lower classes at this time, a lot of families still can't afford to have the mother not work outside the home. And even if she didn't work in a factory, she might do other odd jobs that she could do out of the home. And to demonstrate the cult of domesticity, here's a quote from a book about homemaking for women from 1889, which you may find amusing or enraging. A man who spends most of his day away from the family, who has to work outside the home, counts on finding a restful and refreshing atmosphere when he returns home, and sometimes even a little merriment or a surprise. It is his wife's duty to ensure that he is not disappointed in his expectation. She must do her utmost to make his stay at home as pleasant as possible. She can thus continue to keep her influence over him and retain his affection undiminished. So that definitely demonstrates the idea of separate spheres for men and women, and some of the values of the cult of domesticity, especially submissiveness. All right, let's talk about birth control and family planning. So birth control at this time in the late 19th century is still taboo and very restricted. So it was definitely still looked down upon to use birth control, and considered kind of embarrassing to have to go purchase birth control at a store or something like that. And there are a lot of restrictions on who had access to it. But there is a movement towards women having more control over this and people being able to limit their family size if they want to. So it's just a baby step in that direction. The development of the rubber industry contributed to this. So a form of birth control that became common is something that is similar to a diaphragm, which I don't think you guys even know what that is these days, but it's like a piece of rubber that a woman could insert before sexual activity to prevent her from becoming pregnant. And so limiting the number of children first became popular among the upper classes and later diffused to the lower classes. Part of this has to do with the fact that children now, at least elementary age children, are in school. There's also laws that have been passed restricting the work of children outside the home. And so children become seen as dependents, people that the family and the parents need to take care of and pay for their existence rather than little wage earners. And so since that changes and people don't necessarily need as many children out working to provide for the family, there's just a different view on the number of children among some people. Also during this time, there are a lot of changes for women in the workplace. And some of these we already went over in some earlier slides. But we know that in the first wave of the Industrial Revolution, there are laws that end up restricting the work of women and children. And so these gradually pushed a lot of women out of factory work. So women tended to turn to other jobs. Lower class women often tried to find jobs that they could do sort of out of their home. So they're not working in factories, but they're still working for other people. So for example, lower class women might take in laundry from an upper class family and do their laundry. They might do sewing and mending, again, for upper class people. And those are things they can still do at home, but they're still earning outside money for their family. And then we also know that there are new jobs that opened to women with the Second Industrial Revolution. And now that women also are going to get in elementary education, they have more skills for some of these jobs. So some examples would be secretaries, nurses, teachers, shop workers, telephone operators. Now the ideal woman, ideal in quotes here, again, is still a stay-at-home wife and mother. So it's considered a status symbol for a woman if she doesn't have to work outside the home to support her family. But these jobs still could be for a wide variety of women, or especially women who were single. They just hadn't gotten married yet, or they're single by choice. These are opportunities for them to be able to support themselves. There were also some changes in marriage. So we've learned prior to the late 19th century in Europe, arranged marriage was extremely common among all different social classes, and parents would arrange a marriage often to benefit the family in some way. There's a shift in this in the late 19th century to the idea of marriage based on love and companionship as opposed to arranged marriage. So the idea that you're going to find someone who you fall in love with, that you want to marry, and it's going to be more of your choice, starts to become a more common idea. That doesn't mean that this happens all the time still. So economic ties are still very important to a lot of families. They want a marriage that benefits the family in some way, and they want their child to marry someone of a similar or higher social class. But it's definitely a shift more towards choosing your own spouse like we think of today. So the fact that we have laws restricting work hours changes the way people approach leisure activities as well, because we start to develop more like what we think of today in the Western world as the 40-hour work week, where we work a certain number of hours per day and then we have the weekend off. That becomes a new concept. Like before that, the weekend was not even really a thing. I mean, you had Sundays off to go to church, but other than that, you worked all the time. And some jobs even began providing vacation time for people. And so new activities developed. Vacations were a pretty new concept. This was also made possible by the railroad and new forms of transportation, because now people can easily travel to other places outside their own city. So the idea of going to the beach for the day, or going to visit another city and seeing like museums and different things they have there, these were new ideas that became popular. Amusement parks developed for the first time. The introduction of gas and electric streetlights allowed people to go out and do activities at night, which if you think about now, I mean, think about like concerts and theater and movies and all these things. We generally do those things at night, and this allowed people to go out and do those types of things. Dance halls, team sports, and professional sports. This is a new development because these are sports that are spectator, not participatory. So the idea that people are going to just go watch other people play sports is a new concept. Museums, theaters, and opera houses. That also goes along with the redesign of cities. With the redesign of cities in the late 19th century, they want to offer new amenities and cultural activities for people, which all of those are examples of. And this just shows you some images of those. So on the left, we have pictures of an amusement park. At the top right, we have a cricket team, and at the bottom, a theater or an opera house. All of these new developments in the Second Industrial Revolution and changes in life in the late 19th century contributed to mass production or mass consumption. Actually, both. So the Industrial Revolution and the development of European overseas empires created access to a lot of different products. Higher wages by the late 19th century also provided Europeans with disposable income. Disposable income is what you have left over after you pay your bills. So it's the money you have left over to just kind of do what you want with it. And transportation and different technologies like the steamship, the railroad, and refrigerated boxcars allowed goods to be shipped throughout Europe to different places. They even developed the icebox, which you see on the bottom right corner. This is not a refrigerator because you have to put a block of ice in it. You see that in the top right there of that picture. But it's a way for people to preserve foods within their homes, which hadn't really been possible before. So basically, a whole wave of new products directed just at consumers like you and me developed during the late 19th century. With all these new products, a new type of store developed, which is the department store. So a store where you can now buy a vast amount of different goods in different categories was a new development. And with new transportation technologies within cities, like streetcars and trolleys, people can now afford to travel to one part of the city just to go shopping. Previously, people would just shop in their own little neighborhood, and there'd be a different store for each kind of different thing, like a hardware store, a butcher, a seamstress, etc. Now, people can travel easily from one side of the city to another. And this especially led to the increase in advertising. Advertisements especially were directed towards women because a lot of these new developments were things for the home, which we'll look at. If you lived outside of a city, catalogs became more common, and so you could look through a catalog and order all different kinds of things through the mail if you lived outside of an urban area. And so some of these new manufactured goods included things like clothing, processed food, and labor-saving devices. So this is a picture of that. This is a labor-saving device. I don't know if you can tell what it is, but it's an early washing machine. So you can kind of see why some of these things would be geared towards women, because they're things that are supposed to make women's job in the home easier. Also, with all of this mass consumption and advertising, we now have the development of fads. Some of the earliest fads in the late 19th century were bicycles and new forms of fashion. So on the next few slides, I have some pictures that show you what's going on here and just show you some examples of these things. So here's a picture of an early department store. Just try to think for a minute. Imagine you're a person who just moved to the big city from a farm, and you go into a store like this, and there's just look at how many products there are to buy just in this one room. So this is a huge new thing for people living in cities. All right, here are some funny advertisements. So some of these are not European, they're American, but it's a similar thing. On the left, we have Coca-Cola, which you can see is especially designed at this time and marketed for headaches and mental and physical exhaustion. And you may or may not know that that's because originally Coca-Cola had cocaine in it. On the right, we have an advertisement, heal your asthma with cigarettes. Amazing. Again, we have new fashion trends. So here's an advertisement emphasizing corsets. On the right, we have an advertisement appealing to women's role as mother. So soothing syrup for your infant who's teething. Here we have some examples of processed foods. So the idea that you can go buy food like in a can and take it home and just heat it up, that's a new concept in this time period. So we have an advertisement for soups and an advertisement for beef broth. Again, these are supposed to be things that save time for people in the home rather than making everything from scratch. Here we have an example of a catalog, so the front cover, and then the inside where you can see this one particular page is advertising furniture, but these would be like a little, almost like a department store through the mail where you could order any kind of product for your home. And then here we have some demonstrations of the newest fads. So bicycles were all the rage in the late 19th century, and different manufacturers created different types of bicycles like you see here to try to bring in new customers. And then we also have an advertisement for women's fashion. So something like that is so ubiquitous today, we don't even think about it. But that whole idea of advertising different and new styles that people wouldn't want to buy was the new concept. So the very last thing here is changes in attitudes towards the poor and suffering groups. So like I discussed earlier, the previous attitude towards the poor and lower classes was that they must have done something to create their situation. So either not working hard or being a sinful, non-religious person, something like that. In the late 19th century, it became more common for middle class and upper class women to especially become involved in charity work for the disadvantaged. And so there's certain groups of people that are seen as the worthy poor or people that are deserving of charity. And they included groups such as young prostitutes, children, women, and the elderly. One of the things that goes along with this is the abolition of slavery. And Great Britain was one of the biggest slave traders in the world. William Wilberforce, who was a member of Parliament in Britain, supposedly after a religious experience, realized that slavery was not right, and he spent the rest of his life trying to abolish it. Slavery was abolished in all British lands in 1833. And Great Britain, we know, though, still imported lots of raw materials from slave plantations and other areas. But definitely this movement towards helping disadvantaged people kind of goes along with the abolition of slavery. It was, of course, also heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas. One of those groups considered the worthy poor were prostitutes, and prostitution was legal throughout Europe, but definitely looked down upon. And as we had this increasing movement towards middle-class family values and emphasizing the cult of domesticity and all these things, there was growing concern about prostitution, that this is really an issue that society needs to tackle and fix. And so the British passed the Contagious Diseases Act, which allowed police to examine any prostitute for signs of disease and lock them up. So there's a movement towards making all of this illegal. Josephine Butler, who you see here, who was a middle-class woman, led the Ladies' National Association Against Abuse of Poor Women. And so she took a different tactic towards this. Rather than prosecution of prostitutes, she wanted to try to help them. And so she worked to establish educational programs for women without opportunity. So it was thought that by people of her nature, that women who fell into prostitution, it was because they had no other options in life or something that happened to them where they needed a way to provide for themselves, and that's why they became a prostitute. And so she wanted to offer alternatives and give women some training so that they could get more respectable jobs in society. A couple other movements towards charity and helping the disadvantaged. Sunday school, which is school taught at church on Sunday, first developed to provide education for poor children. So especially in places where compulsory education hadn't been introduced, Sunday schools were a place where children could go to learn how to read and write. And then they would also have religious values hopefully instilled in them. The goal really here is for them to be able to read the Bible, but it definitely had the impact of providing literacy as well. And then lastly, the temperance movement. So we know that alcoholism and the consumption of alcohol definitely increased with the Industrial Revolution and the misery found in cities. Alcoholism became more of a common thing. And so temperance is really a reaction to that. Temperance is the movement to restrict production and consumption of alcohol. This became a really popular charity among middle-class women, and it kind of goes along with that whole idea of family values in the middle class, that we want to eliminate these negative things from society that could potentially, especially poorly influence our children. The Salvation Army, which we know today as kind of a different kind of charity than this, was founded in Britain during this time, and one of their major goals was accomplishing temperance. And this just shows you an image from that movement. And so temperance was definitely tied into religious values as well. So on the back, we have remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, train up a child in the way he should go, which are both biblical references. And then we have posters against drinking and alcoholism and things like that. So that's a quick overview of some of the major changes in 19th century Europe. We will, I believe you're going to go ahead and do a CCOT activity related to these things that you've just learned.